Hello, I'm Bill Monroe, and welcome to episode 85 of 2-Minute Talk Tips. This week's tip, take a beat. A speaker heads to their spot on the stage, stops, looks out at the audience for a moment, and then starts speaking. Why? Taking a beat before you start your talk or start your presentation is a way of shifting modes, because at that moment you are suddenly shifting from prep and practice to actual presentation. Suddenly all those things that you have been working on, that you have been checking on, that you have been revising and editing and making sure your projector works and editing your slides and doing another spell check and rehearsing and planning what you are going to do when you're out on stage. Suddenly, that whole process is over. It's an important mind shift, and it's an important way of rethinking what you're doing, because suddenly you have to go from thinking about dozens of things to thinking about one thing. And that one thing is effectively delivering your message and your story to your audience. So in that moment, just before your presentation begins, stop moving. Plant your feet, take a deep breath, and then begin. If you prefer, you can go ahead and take this beat in the wings before you actually come onto the stage. And then your walk from off stage to the place on stage where you're going to be speaking is a part of your presentation as well. And when you take that beat, you can be better prepared to have an impact in slowly and deliberately walking out onto the stage to take your place and conduct your talk. So before your next talk, take a beat when it's time to transition to presentation mode. Stick around, and after the break, we're going to talk about apologies. Welcome back. I owe you an apology. Well, actually, what I really owe you is a discussion about apologies. Sorry about that. I've recently started listening to a podcast called VO Boss. It's about the voiceover industry and about managing your own business as a voiceover artist. It's a fun podcast with a great dynamic between the two hosts, and they're funny and energetic and informative, and, it's just a great show to listen to. Recently, they had an episode about apologies and why you shouldn't say, "I'm sorry." And there were two scenarios where it particularly stood out, where one of the hosts was talking about how she would go into the recording booth in front of engineers, and whenever she would make a mistake, she would say, "Oh, I'm sorry." And how she tries now to coach her students not to do that, not to say, "I'm sorry" for each mistake they make in the booth, and instead to just take a moment, go back to the previous sentence, and just start that line again to get it right, rather than apologizing every time, because apologizing every time wastes a lot of studio time, and it's expensive, and it's annoying, and it undermines you as an artist. Another example of this was also apologizing when trying to collect money from a client who wasn't paying in a timely manner. And there is no reason to be apologizing for that. There is no reason an entrepreneur should feel guilty about trying to get the money they are rightfully owed. Contacting a client who hasn't been paying their bill and apologizing makes no sense. It's the client in that case who really owes the apology. But because of patterns we've learned over our lives, we tend to open with, "I'm sorry about this." And listening to that episode made me think back to some of my retail training back in the mid-90s with Ultimate Electronics. They had a fantastic training program. It's an organization that didn't actually survive for a number of reasons, but the training program for new salespeople at new locations was really phenomenal. And some of the things I learned in training at Ultimate Electronics is still stuff that I use today to approach how I coach salespeople and others to be more effective in their roles. But one of the things they taught us in training was that when there is an issue with a customer, you never say to the customer, "I'm sorry." Instead, what you say is, "I apologize." And that simple change of words has a powerful impact on the message we are trying to convey and the impression we are trying to leave. So this week, I'm going to explore elements around apologies from stage. First of all, I'm going to talk about the difference between "I'm sorry" and "I apologize." Next, I'm going to talk about the idea of whether you should be apologizing at all. Then I'll talk about the idea of offering reasons or excuses for why things went wrong. And finally, I'll wrap up with a discussion about the idea of the word "and" versus the word "but." So to begin with, let's talk about the difference between "I'm sorry" and "I apologize." I think this is very important to how we perceive ourselves and how we want our audience to perceive us as well. When you say "I'm sorry," that's really a very passive phrase versus "I apologize," which is a more active phrase. When something goes wrong and you start off with saying "I'm sorry," you're now describing yourself. You're telling somebody about yourself and the kind of person that you are a sorry person. And really, all you're doing is giving the person you're speaking to more information about yourself. It doesn't really accomplish anything. On the other hand, when you say "I apologize," you're taking a more active perspective in the situation. Even if the actual actions that you do don't change, what you are doing is you are taking linguistic action. You are in an active state now. You are apologizing. You're engaging in an activity rather than just describing yourself as a person. And that's one of the key things that makes "I apologize" different from "I'm sorry." By taking action and by adopting a more action-oriented style of language, it sounds like you're working to fix the problem. And hopefully you are, so that it doesn't happen again. But when you start with that perspective of "I apologize" instead of "I'm sorry," it makes you sound more confident. It makes you sound more like you're in charge. And from the stage, you are generally going to be better off with an action-oriented approach. Some might say that's just words and that doesn't matter. But as a speaker, words are your primary tool. You are using words to share your message, to share your story. The very fact that you stand up in front of a room for people to listen to you, to listen to your words, shows that you are already putting a premium on words. So make sure that whenever possible, you choose the most appropriate words to accomplish what it is you are trying to accomplish. And that means taking that more active approach of saying, "I apologize." Of course, that assumes that you should be apologizing to begin with. Usually when we screw up, apologizing is a good idea. But does the screw up get noticed? You see, one of the things I've talked about in the past and that many speakers have encountered in their career is that you might practice extensively, hours and hours and days and weeks, and something goes wrong. You skip a section, you get some stuff out of order, and suddenly it starts to throw you off of your game. You suddenly get stressed and get confused and you don't know what to do, and sometimes you'll go ahead and apologize to the audience for doing that and for making those mistakes, or for skipping that key fact, or for skipping that slide, or for any number of other reasons and other mistakes that happen. But you see, here's the thing. Your audience probably never even noticed the mistake. And they probably would not have noticed it at all if you had not pointed it out. Now, you could argue that radical transparency and credibility demands that you let your audience know. And in some cases, maybe that's true. But in general, if the audience is not going to know that you've made a mistake, don't tell them. Don't let them know that the experience they are a part of is a flawed experience. Don't let them know that they are missing out on things they could have gotten had you not made a mistake. Because when you do that, you are undermining their experience. You are decreasing the value of the experience that they got over a minor issue that they would never have noticed otherwise. There's no benefit to telling the audience that they have had a less than perfect experience if they would not have noticed it to begin with. So I think that's an important filter to put on the question of whether or not you should apologize for something. And sometimes it will be painfully obvious that something has gone wrong. Maybe your computer crashes, or maybe you start 15 minutes late. And there's all sorts of other things where the audience will definitely know. And maybe in those cases, if it is the fault of you, the speaker, or your organization, then yes, you should be able to start with a simple, I apologize. But just because things are less than ideal, maybe there is a sudden blackout in the room, or the fire alarm goes off, or there's all sorts of other things that can go wrong that are clearly not your fault and not the fault of your organization, then those are not necessarily things you should be apologizing for. You see, when you go ahead and apologize for something, you are taking responsibility not only for the problem itself, but for the solution to the problem, and for taking steps to make sure that it does not happen again, and to fix and mitigate the losses that the customer, that the attendee is experiencing as a result of that mistake. If it is not something you have any ability to control, if it is not something that you can make up to them, then maybe it's not something you should be apologizing for. And in general, I think many of the speakers we see who start apologizing for things from stage are probably apologizing excessively. It goes beyond that, though. You see, a speaker who is always apologizing is actually undermining their own message and their own credibility. You see, they are demonstrating a lack of confidence. And the more you do this, the more little tiny things that you apologize for from the stage, the more the audience is going to notice them. And the more the audience notices them, the less confidence they'll have in your ability to do what it is you are trying to do. And you'll see that in their eyes. You'll see that in their faces when they have that loss of confidence in you. And you know what happens to many speakers when they see that? They get even more nervous. They lose more confidence, and they start making more mistakes and apologizing more. And then the audience notices that even more. And it becomes a vicious cycle that builds and builds and builds on itself until that speaker's nerves just get the better of them and really undermine the entire reason they're there to begin with. And that's to share their message and to inspire their call to action. The bottom line here is that if the audience doesn't know that anything is wrong, don't tell them. They don't need to know generally. And don't get yourself into a pointless apology cycle. The other key thing to keep in mind about apologies is that we should generally avoid reasons. Avoid trying to come up with excuses or explanations for what happened and for what went wrong, because for the most part, people just don't care. They don't care about the reason that something went wrong. What they care about is what you're going to do about it. How are you going to make it up? How are you going to prevent it from happening again? So yes, it's important to understand the reasons. It's important to understand the causes. But ultimately, you don't have to share that with your audience. You can be a lot more effective when something goes wrong and you simply stand up there and say, I apologize for that. And leave it at that. You don't have to go on with, well, I apologize for that. My shipping vendor screwed up and sent my handouts to the wrong hotel. Or I apologize for my delay. I got confused with all the different elevators here. You know how that goes. You see, all of those different explanations for whatever it is, they don't help solve the problem. They are an attempt to mitigate your responsibility. And when you stand up there and accept responsibility by saying, I apologize, and then try and mitigate that, you're undermining your very apology. And people just don't want that. They just want to move on. They just want to get the results. They just want to get the value for their time that they are hoping to get for that day. And they are hoping that you are going to be there to provide them that value. Focus on that. Focus on that value. Focus on the things that you are trying to accomplish. Focus on your message and focus on driving to that call to action rather than trying to minimize your responsibility for things that go wrong. There are times when I've been a speaker and things have gone wrong and I've simply apologized even though it wasn't my fault, even though there was nothing I could do about it. But sometimes simply standing up there and saying, I apologize, allows you to move on. Allows you to engage more deeply. And it may seem like I'm undermining my previous point there, where I said maybe you don't always have to apologize. And it's a tough balance. But the key thing is that there are times when the audience knows that something is wrong. And if you can simply say, I apologize, to accept that responsibility, to start figuring out what you can do in the future to make sure that doesn't happen again, and most importantly, to move on and to give your audience the best experience possible, because that's why you're there. You have your goal for being there, and you'll notice everything I talk about here, it all keeps coming back to making sure that what you are doing on that stage is in service of your goal, is in service of your purpose for speaking at that event, is in service of helping to drive the call to action that you are hoping to achieve. Because ultimately, when you are speaking, everything that you are doing is about your message, because that's what matters. It's about your goals, because that's what matters. That's why you're there. That's why your audience is there. So ultimately, keep the focus on driving to your goal. And that brings me to one other linguistic quirk I would like to talk about. Well, I guess it's not really so much a linguistic quirk as much as a linguistic choice. And this is something I first learned about listening to the Manager Tools podcast, another great show for folks who try to manage teams and want to manage teams more effectively. And they're also a very big fan of the word effectively. One of the things they talked about was trying to purge the word but from your vocabulary, because usually you don't actually need it. You can replace but with the word and for the most part. Consider how these two statements sound different. Well, I apologize, but I won't let that happen again. Or, I apologize, and I won't let that happen again. Changing that one word changes the entire tone of that sentence, from one of trying to avoid some responsibility to one of creating a to-do list to make sure that things don't go wrong again. As a general rule, instead of saying the word but when you want to disagree with something, like I am sorry, but, or try I apologize and, take that action, take that step, build that plan to make sure that things are going to be different in the future. The other cool thing about making this linguistic change is that normally when you say to somebody, I agree with this for the most part, but there's also this problem, versus, well, I agree with you for the most part, and there's also this problem to talk about. You see, when you start off by saying, I agree with you, but, What you're doing is you're undermining your entire first sentence. You're taking away its impact. You're saying, I was just saying this to be polite, and you're still wrong. And that's not the message you want to convey. That just isn't as helpful when it comes to working with folks. And working with folks requires you to be effective because that's why you're doing it. You want to get stuff done. Often, simply swapping in the word "and" suddenly makes things less confrontational, less acrimonious, less about a competition, and more about a partnership. So when you are making your apologies, try substituting the word "and" for the word "but." And as you go through your day-to-day business at work, try and replace the word "but" with the word "and" as much as possible. You can even just start out by just sort of doing it in your head when you see something happening or when you observe a conversation and when you read something in an email. See how things change and see how the sounds of your sentences change when you make that simple substitution. So that's it for this week. Try to substitute the phrase "I apologize" for the phrase "I'm sorry" to take more action. Be sure to consider whether or not you should be apologizing before you actually apologize. Avoid giving reasons when making apologies. And try to substitute the word "and" for the word "but" in various business conversations. So what did you think about this episode? Go ahead and leave a comment over at 2minutetalktips.com/apology. As I'm recording this particular episode, today is in fact World Stroke Day, October 29th. Get your blood pressure checked. And if your blood pressure is not in the safe range, work with your doctor or your medical team to do what you have to do to get it there. Be sure to check out 2minutetalktips.com for even more ways to become a more effective speaker. Take a breath before your next talk. And of course, as always, don't get best, get better. Thanks a lot. I'm Bill Monroe, and I'll talk to you next week.
Two-Minute Talk Tips is a proud production of the Currently Speaking Podcast Network.